I never thought I'd be at war with my HOA. But when they planted a sign on my land, claimed my family's farm was their public campsite, and began building facilities like they owned the place, I realized I was under attack. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a calculated land grab, led by a power-hungry HOA president whose husband just happened to be a judge. They thought I'd stay silent. They thought I'd back down. They were wrong. Strangers were camping on my soil, tearing up the fields my grandfather planted, the same land that's been in my family for over 70 years. So I fought back. Now tell me this. What would you do if someone tried to steal your land in broad daylight, and the law was on their side? I always thought fights like that were for angry neighbors or people with too much time. But when they put a sign on my land and told strangers they could ride dirt bikes through my wheat field, something in me snapped. They didn't just cross a line, they stomped all over it with muddy boots. It was a cold Saturday morning in late March when it all began. The sound of dirt bikes woke me up, loud, buzzing engines. At first, I thought it was a dream. But as the sound got louder, I jumped out of bed, threw on my boots, and ran outside. That's when I saw them, 3 teenagers speeding across my north field, tearing through the winter wheat I had planted months ago. My heart sank. The field wasn't just crops. It was my memory of Sarah, my late wife. She loved how the golden wheat swayed against the blue mountain sky. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms. "This is private property! Get off my land!" The kids stopped. One of them took off his helmet and pointed to a small sign near the edge of the field. "The HOA lady said we could ride here," he said. "She told us yesterday." I walked over to the sign. It was brand new, shiny, well-made, and firmly planted in my soil. It read, Pinehurst Gardens Community Recreation Area. My blood boiled. "I don't care what she said," I told them. "This is the Richardson family farm. Been in our name for over 70 years. You're trespassing." Thankfully, the boys didn't argue. They shrugged and rode off. I yanked the sign out of the ground and marched back to my house, my hands shaking. This wasn't the first time the Pinehurst Gardens HOA had acted like they owned the place. They had tried to push me around before sending letters, complaining about my old barn, hinting that my land could be better used. But this? This was a declaration of war. I called Mrs. Lockhart, the HOA president. She answered after 4 rings, her voice sickly sweet. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "what seems to be the problem now?" "You know exactly what the problem is," I snapped. "You put signs on my land and told kids they could ride bikes through my crops." "Oh dear," she said, feigning concern. "I think you're confused again. That area is part of our community recreation zone. It was rezoned years ago. You should check your deed." "My deed is perfectly clear," I growled. "Your subdivision ends 50 yards before my field starts. You know that." She sighed dramatically. "Well, the board disagrees. We have paperwork showing that parcel was rezoned. Maybe you should speak to your lawyer before making accusations." Then she hung up. I stood there, gripping my coffee mug so tight I thought it might shatter. I called my neighbor Elaine. She was the only person in Pinehurst who had always been kind to me. She had warned me this might happen. "They want that land," she had said once. "Ever since their pool project failed, the HOA's been desperate to expand." That Saturday, I walked every inch of my boundary. I took pictures of the damaged wheat, of the sign, and marked the edges of my field with orange flags. I even dug out the old family deed. The land had been mine since 1943. My grandfather bought it with his last dime. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept hearing the roar of engines and seeing Sarah's smile in the wheat field. Sunday morning came with worse news. I was pouring coffee when I heard voices, a lot of them. From my window, I saw tents going up. Cars were parked along the dirt road. People were setting up coolers and folding chairs. My jaw dropped. There had to be 20 people, all in my field. 2 men were putting up a portable toilet right next to my irrigation point. I threw on my coat and rushed outside. "Excuse me." I called to a family unloading camping chairs from a shiny SUV. "This is private property, not a campground." The dad looked confused. "This is the Pinehurst Gardens Community Campsite," he said. "We reserved it through the HOA." "I'm James Richardson," I said firmly. "This is my land. There is no community campsite here. A woman approached holding a printed map. But look, she said, pointing. The HOA sent this. It clearly marks this area as a community campground. Others came forward, showing the same map, the same lies, the same confusion. They'd all paid the HOA to camp here. I'm sorry, I told them. You were misled. This land is not for public use. Please pack up and leave. A voice from the back shouted, "We paid for this. We want a refund." That's between you and the HOA, I replied. Talk to Mrs. Lockhart. Just then, a black Range Rover pulled up. Out stepped Mrs. Lockhart, dressed like she was going to a garden party. White pants, pastel blouse, and a smug smile. "Good morning," she chirped, ignoring me completely. "Is there a problem?" "This man says we're trespassing," said the dad. She laughed softly. "Mr. Richardson is confused. This land has been part of our community plan for quite some time." "That's a lie," I snapped. "Show me where I agreed to give up my land." She turned to me, her smile never fading. "The agreement was signed in 2008. The board has the documents. Now, if you'll excuse me, these nice families have plans." "I never signed anything," I growled. She turned to the crowd. "Please enjoy your day. Mr. Richardson won't cause any more trouble. Unless..." She gave me a hard look. "He wants to take this up with our attorneys." Then she walked away, leaving me speechless. By sunset, the field was filled with children running, people grilling, and volleyball nets going up. I stood in my kitchen, watching through the window, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a takeover, and I had a feeling it was just the beginning. I grabbed my camera and began snapping pictures of everything: the campers, the toilet, the tents. I would build my case piece by piece. But that night, something dark settled over me. Something I hadn't felt in years. This was war, and I was going to fight with everything I had. As I reviewed the pictures on my camera, a noise outside made me freeze. The sound of hammers. Floodlights lit up the north field. My heart dropped. Construction workers were building something. They were building on my land at night. I stepped outside into the cold, muddy darkness, clutching my camera. And then I saw her, Mrs. Lockhart, watching me from her Range Rover. She rolled down her window and smiled. "Trespassing at night, Mr. Richardson?" she said. "That's not very neighborly." Then she drove off slow and smug as the building continued behind her. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw headlights. I heard voices laughing in the dark, feet stomping through the wheat, and hammers pounding on wood that should never be on my land. By morning, I was exhausted and angry. They were building something big. I could see the structure from my porch. It wasn't a simple tent or porta potty. This looked like the start of a permanent building, a bathroom facility. On my property, I stormed into my kitchen and called my lawyer, Frank Watson, a quiet, sharp man who had worked with my family for over 30 years. He answered on the third ring. "They're building on my land now," I told him. "Last night construction started, and Lockhart was there watching me." He let out a low whistle. "That's bad, James. Very bad. Come to my office. Bring photos. Bring your deed." An hour later, I was sitting across from him, shoving a folder of pictures across his desk. He flipped through them, his jaw tightening. "They installed a bathroom?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Next to my irrigation pipes," I said, "and they gave people a map showing my field as community property." Frank frowned. "We need to act fast. This isn't just trespassing. This smells like forgery." "She said I signed something in 2008. I told him. "I didn't. She's lying." Frank picked up his phone and called the HOA lawyer. He put the call on speaker. The voice on the other end was smooth and cold. "Yes, Mr. Richardson signed over usage rights to the land in 2008 in exchange for water access. The HOA has paid property taxes on that parcel since then." "That's false," I shouted. Frank held up his hand to silence me. "We'll need to see that agreement immediately." "Of course," the lawyer replied. "We can arrange a meeting for Wednesday." When the call ended, Frank turned to me. "Don't confront anyone before then. Don't escalate. Gather every document you can, especially tax records." I nodded and left. The rest of the day, I buried myself in files. I went to the county records office. Mrs. Gonzalez, the clerk, helped me dig through decades of records. She had known my grandfather. After hours of searching, she frowned. There's a note here from 2009 about a boundary change, but the papers are missing. Missing? I asked. My heart pounded. She nodded. The change was logged, but the supporting documents, the actual forms, they're gone. Who requested this file last? I asked. She checked the log, then paused. Judge Lockhart's clerk, about a month ago. I felt dizzy. Judge Lockhart, her husband. The picture was getting clearer now, and uglier. Back home, I stared at my fields through the kitchen window. I thought of my wife, of Grandpa, of everything they built. This land was our legacy, and they were trying to erase it. Wednesday evening, the HOA boardroom was packed. Dozens of residents sat in rows, many with cold stares. Some whispered behind hands. I could feel the tension. Mrs. Lockhart sat at the head of the table, flawless as always. Her husband wasn't there, but I could feel his power in the room. The board members beside her were all nodding along like trained parrots. We'll begin with the Richardson matter, she announced, smiling. I stood beside Frank. My hands were shaking with rage. This man claims we've encroached on his property, she continued, but we have documentation. She slid a paper across the table. Frank picked it up, studying it carefully. This signature, he said slowly, looks like Mr. Richardson's, but it isn't notarized. That's correct, Mrs. Lockhart said. It was an informal agreement. I stepped forward. That's not my signature. I never signed that. The room erupted in murmurs. Mr. Thompson, an old board member whose grandkids used to chase my chickens, crossed his arms. Are you accusing the board of forgery? I'm stating a fact, I said. This is fake. I never signed this. Frank flipped the paper over. No notary, no witnesses, and Mr. Richardson has paid taxes on this land every year without HOA contribution. We have records to prove it. I placed my tax records on the table. The board barely looked at them. Mrs. Lockhart smiled. The agreement was that Mr. Richardson would continue paying taxes while we used the land for community purposes. There is no such agreement, Frank said firmly. Not without legal documentation. An elderly woman raised her hand in the back. I've lived here since before the subdivision, she said. That land has always belonged to the Richardson farm. Mrs. Lockhart's smile froze. Thank you, Mrs. Patel, but unless you have written proof, personal memories aren't helpful. The meeting devolved into noise, yelling, whispers, accusations. That's when I saw Elaine enter the back of the room. She motioned for me to follow her. Frank noticed and called for a 5-minute break. Outside in the hallway, Elaine pulled me aside. You need to know the truth, she said, voice low. They're not just after your field for camping. What do you mean? I overheard Mrs. Lockhart last week. She was on the phone with a developer. They're planning to build glamping cabins on your land. Luxury tents, paid memberships. My blood turned to ice. Elaine looked around nervously. And Judge Lockhart is helping. He's using his kids to push the permits through quietly. Frank's eyes narrowed. That's a conflict of interest. Why are you telling me this? I asked her. They'll come after you. She smiled sadly. They already made my life hell. Last month, they fined my neighbor $500 because his grass was an inch too tall while he was at his sister's funeral. We returned to the room with fire in our veins. But as we walked back in, Mrs. Lockhart stood and announced, the board has voted to move forward with our community recreation plan. If Mr. Richardson interferes, we'll file for an injunction. On what grounds? Frank demanded. She smiled sweetly. Judge Lockhart has already reviewed the matter informally. He supports our position. Silence filled the room. I stood there stunned. Her husband, a sitting judge, had secretly reviewed a case that involved his own wife and her financial interests. That wasn't just unethical. That was criminal. As the meeting ended, people filed out. Many avoided my gaze. Mr. Thompson walked up to me and leaned in close. You're fighting a losing battle, he whispered. This weekend is our annual summer barbecue. We're holding it in the campsite your field. County officials will be there. Don't show your face. Elaine clutched my arm as he walked off. "Jimmy, they're going to make it official. They're showing off to claim the land." "I need to stop them," I said. She nodded. "But how?" I didn't answer. My mind was spinning. Back home, I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. I stared out at the bathroom they were building on my property. The illegal plumbing, the trash, the disrespect. That's when I noticed something. Rain puddling near the pipes. A storm was coming, and I had an idea. That night, I crawled under my old equipment shed in the rain. Mud soaked through my clothes as I worked the rusted valve with shaking hands. 3 valves in total. 1 in the barn, 1 near the apple trees, 1 here, under the shed. Each one part of my grandfather's irrigation system, a system I legally owned. And if I turned them all the right way, they wouldn't just lose their bathroom, they'd have a very public, very messy disaster on their hands. Thunder shook the sky like warning drums, and water ran in rivers across my farm. But I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching headlights come and go as workers continued setting up for the HOA's big barbecue on my land, bold as ever, like they owned the place. The new bathroom was finished. A big white portable building sat right over my irrigation channel. They'd connected their plumbing to my system without permission. My land, my water. But they made one mistake. They forgot who controlled the flow. At dawn, I pulled out Grandpa's old maps, yellowed, brittle paper full of hand-drawn lines and notes. The irrigation system was designed to filter water naturally, sending runoff through wetlands before draining into the creek. Their bathroom drained straight into that same system. I didn't need to sabotage anything. That would be illegal. All I had to do was restore the original flow pattern, cut off their unauthorized connection, and let nature do the rest. I suited up and headed to the first valve in the barn. I turned it slowly, redirecting the water. The old pipes groaned in protest, but they obeyed. The second valve, near the apple trees, took more effort. The ground was slippery, but I got it turned. Then came the third, hidden under the equipment shed. Mud soaked my knees and hands as I crawled under the beams. The valve was rusted shut. I yanked and twisted, using every ounce of strength until click it gave way. Water started flowing, strong and steady. The trap was set. By noon, cars began arriving in long rows, parking across the road and even on my front grass. I counted over 100 people, kids, parents, elderly couples, teenagers, even local officials in suits. Mrs. Lockhart arrived last. Her white pantsuit was spotless despite the mud. She waved at people like a queen greeting her subjects. Her husband, Judge Lockhart, was right behind her, shaking hands and laughing. I watched from my porch, binoculars in hand. The field had been turned into a festival. Bright tents, a live band, catering trucks, even a chocolate fountain. My wheat, what little hadn't been crushed, was now buried under tables and decorations. They called it a community celebration. They called it progress. But to me, it looked like theft with a smile. At 3 p.m., the music stopped. People gathered near the stage. Mrs. Lockhart stepped up, microphone in hand. Her voice rang out, "Friends and neighbors, thank you for joining us for the first annual Pinerist Garden Summer Celebration. Today, we celebrate our beautiful community and this new recreational space that will bring joy to families for generations." The crowd clapped. She smiled wider. "And I'm thrilled to announce that next spring, we'll break ground on our luxury glamping retreat, a members-only nature escape, right here on this land." My land. That's when it happened. A small child screamed. Then a mother yelled. People near the bathroom area started backing away, waving their hands in front of their faces. A dark puddle had formed around the building. Then another, and then another. The ground was too soft. The rain was too heavy. The bathroom pipes, overloaded and blocked, had started to back up. And it wasn't just water coming out. A foul, choking smell filled the air. Sewage. Real, raw sewage bubbling up through the pipes, spilling into the muddy field. Screams broke out. People ran, slipping and falling. The chocolate fountain was abandoned. Expensive shoes were left behind. Someone tripped and dropped an entire tray of shrimp into the muck. Mrs. Lockhart froze on stage, microphone still in hand. Judge Lockhart tried to help her down, but slipped in the mess. His white pants were ruined. I stood by my fence watching silently. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. Sheriff Daniels arrived 30 minutes later. His patrol truck stopped at my gate. He looked tired. "Mrs. Lockhart says you did this," he said as I led him inside. "I didn't do anything illegal," I replied, handing him a folder. "These are my water rights, my land survey, and the original irrigation maps. All I did was restore water flow on my side of the property." He looked through the documents. "They hooked their bathroom up to the system?" "Yes, without asking, without permits." Just then, his radio crackled. It was the county environmental inspector. He had arrived at the scene. "There's no permit for the plumbing," the voice said. "Sewage is leaking into protected wetlands. This is a serious violation." Sheriff Daniels looked at me again, this time with something like respect. "This is going to get messy," he said. I nodded. "Already is." That night, the news broke online. Someone had taken photos of the sewage flooding the party. A reporter snapped pictures of guests running, covered in mud and worse. The headline read, "Oh, a celebration turns into biohazard nightmare." Mrs. Lockhart went silent. Judge Lockhart stopped showing up at court. But it wasn't over. Not even close. 3 days later, a man in a suit showed up at my door with a smug smile. "You've been served," he said, handing me a thick envelope. Inside was a lawsuit over 100 pages. The HOA was suing me for $2 million, claiming intentional sabotage, emotional distress, and public humiliation. I called every lawyer in the county. 4 turned me down. The 5th, a young woman named Maria Vasquez, agreed to meet. "They're betting on your fear," she said after reading the lawsuit. "But this is garbage." She flipped to a section about the 2008 agreement. "They're using a forged signature," I told her. "I never signed that." "Then we can fight this," she said, her eyes lighting up. "We can win, but we need more proof." Just then, my doorbell rang. Elaine stood outside, soaked from the rain. Behind her was a nervous-looking woman I didn't recognize. "This is Diane," Elaine said quickly. "She used to work for the HOA. She has something you need to see." Diane stepped forward, hands trembling. She held out a small USB drive. "I was Mrs. Lockhart's assistant for 4 years," she whispered. "She made me scan everything, even things she told me to never mention." I stared at the drive. "What's on it?" "Emails, memos, files she thought were deleted, and something else." She paused. "There's an email from Judge Lockhart. It says, 'No one will check the signature too closely. Just make sure the property description matches what we need.'" My blood ran cold. We had them. The USB drive burned a hole in my hand. Diane, the former HOA assistant, sat quietly at my kitchen table, hands shaking. Elaine stood beside her, arms crossed, daring me to open it. Inside the drive were secrets emails between Mrs. Lockhart and Judge Lockhart, proof of lies, forgery, and betrayal. But one message stood out above the rest. "No one will check the signature too closely. Just make sure the property description matches what we need. HL. Harold Lockhart. The judge. Her husband. It was enough to take down the whole empire." I emailed everything to Maria, my lawyer. 10 minutes later, she called back, voice alive with fire. "This is gold, Jimmy," she said. "We'll crush them." But we couldn't act just yet. We needed timing. Strategy. One wrong move, and they'd bury us under legal tricks. So, we waited. And as we waited, the investigations exploded. The county's environmental agency came first. They slapped the HOA with 5 violations: improper sewage disposal, illegal drainage into protected wetlands, unauthorized plumbing, and no permits for construction. A reporter picked up the story. Soon, headlines read, "OA faces environmental charges for luxury camping disaster. Judge's wife accused of using false documents to seize farm." Neighbors turned on Mrs. Lockhart like wolves sensing weakness. People who had once ignored me now crossed the road just to say, "We're with you, Mr. Richardson." Then came the emergency HOA meeting. I arrived late and sat in the back. Mrs. Lockhart stood before the crowd, dressed in black, like she was attending her own funeral. "This has all been a misunderstanding," she said, voice shaking. The land situation was never meant to cause harm. That's when Mrs. Patel, the elderly woman from before, stood up holding a leather folder. "I kept copies of everything," she said loudly. "Every board meeting, every decision, every budget line you forgot to log." The room went silent. "You changed minutes after we signed them," she said. "You funneled money to your brother in law's fake construction company. And you built that stupid pond in your backyard after fining the Johnsons $300 for doing the same thing." Someone shouted, "You fined me for leaving a trash can out for 2 hours." Another voice, "You said my daughter's lemonade stand was a zoning violation." Chaos broke out. Mr. Thompson, the smug board member, stood up and tried to calm everyone down. "Let's not jump to conclusions." "Sit down, Thompson," someone yelled. "You knew." He sat down. For the first time, I saw fear in Mrs. Lockhart's eyes. The sheriff knocked on her door the next morning. So did the county auditors. So did 2 investigators from the State Bar Association. Judge Lockhart quietly announced a leave of absence. They knew the walls were closing in. But even then, the war wasn't over. The HOA didn't drop the $2 million lawsuit. So we went to court. Maria stood tall in front of the judge, all 5 feet of her blazing with power. She showed the original deed, the water rights, the survey map. Then she dropped the final blow, the USB files, emails, forged documents, scanned agreements created years after the supposed date, all linked to Mrs. Lockhart. The courtroom fell silent when the judge, not her husband, of course held up the fake agreement and said, "This signature doesn't match any legal sample. This isn't admissible." The HOA's lawyers started sweating. They dropped the lawsuit before the hearing even ended. Outside the courthouse, Maria turned to me with a grin. That's what justice feels like. The HOA board was dismantled. Mrs. Lockhart and Judge Lockhart moved to Florida, under investigation for fraud, abuse of power, and environmental violations. Mr. Thompson left town quietly. No one missed him. Diane got a new job at the county clerk's office, her honesty rewarded. Elaine? She became the voice of the neighborhood. Everyone listened to her now. One sunny spring afternoon, I stood at the edge of the north field, the same field they tried to steal. Elaine stood beside me, watching children plant flowers and vegetables in neat little rows. The new HOA board had approached me with a proposal, a real community garden. With my approval, on my terms, with a real signed lease and respect for my boundaries. "Looks nice, doesn't it?" Elaine said, sipping from a cup of cider. I nodded. "It wasn't just about the land," I said. "It was about standing up to bullies, about not letting people in power bend the rules for themselves." She smiled. "You didn't just stop them, Jimmy. You reminded this community who we are." As I walked back toward the house, I pulled out an old photo of Grandpa. He stood in the wheat field, covered in dirt, proud smile on his face. "We protected it," I whispered. "I didn't let them take what you built." Justice had taken time, but in the end, it bloomed.